The wind was howling like a wild animal outside the base supply store, and I could barely see my own hands through the thick snow swirling around. It was my third winter in Alaska, but nights like this still made me question why I ever left the warm beaches of Texas. The thermometer outside read -20 degrees, and that was before the wind chill kicked in. I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended at 9 o'clock. Working supply duty wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me extra money to send home to Mama. She'd been sick for 2 years now, and the medical bills kept piling up higher than the snow outside. Every dollar I could spare went straight to her treatment, which meant I lived on ramen noodles and whatever leftovers I could find in the mess hall. The store was empty, except for me. Nobody in their right mind would venture out in weather like this unless they absolutely had to. I was restocking the shelves with toiletries when I heard a strange sound over the wind. It sounded like crying, but that couldn't be right. Who would be crying outside in a blizzard? I walked to the front window and wiped away the frost with my sleeve. At first, I couldn't see anything through the swirling snow. Then I saw a small, dark shape huddled against the building next to our entrance. My heart nearly stopped when I realized it was a child. I rushed outside without even grabbing my coat. The cold hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. There was a little boy, maybe 8 years old, curled up in a ball against the brick wall. He was wearing nothing but a thin gray sweater and jeans. No coat, no hat, no gloves. His lips were blue, and his whole body was shaking so hard I thought he might fall apart. "Hey there, buddy," I said, kneeling down beside him. "What are you doing out here?" He looked up at me with the biggest brown eyes I'd ever seen. Tears had frozen on his cheeks, and he could barely speak through his chattering teeth. I got lost," he whispered. "I was trying to find my way home, but everything looks the same in the snow." Without thinking twice, I started unbuttoning my navy jacket. It was the warmest thing I owned, and this little guy needed it more than I did. "Here, put this on," I said, wrapping it around his tiny shoulders. The jacket was so big on him it looked like a sleeping bag, but at least it would keep him warm. "Thank you," he said, his voice still shaking. "I'm Ben." "I'm Alexis," I told him. "Ben, where do you live? I'll drive you home." He pointed toward the village area beyond the base. "With my grandma Agnes. She lives in the little blue house near the old church." I knew exactly where he meant. It was about 15 minutes away by car, but it would have taken him hours to walk there in this weather. He probably would have frozen to death before he made it halfway. I helped him to his feet and guided him to my old pickup truck. The heater took forever to warm up, but eventually we had some heat flowing. Ben told me his story as we drove through the empty streets. His parents had died in a fishing accident 2 years ago, and now he lived with his grandmother. She worked as a substitute teacher when she could, but money was tight. "I was at the library doing homework," he explained. "Grandma was working late, and I thought I could walk home by myself. But then the snow got really bad, and I couldn't see where I was going. My heart broke for this kid. He reminded me of my little brother back home, always trying to be independent and take care of himself. When we pulled up to his grandmother's house, I could see the worry on the old woman's face through the window. She came running out before I even had the truck in park. "Ben! Oh my goodness, where have you been?" she cried, pulling him into her arms. "I've been calling everyone looking for you." I explained what had happened, and the grandmother, Agnes, thanked me over and over again. She invited me in for coffee, but I could see they didn't have much, and I didn't want to be a burden. Besides, I needed to get back to base before anyone noticed I was gone. "Keep the jacket," I told Ben as I prepared to leave. "You need it more than I do." "But won't you get in trouble?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. I ruffled his hair and smiled. "Don't worry about me, kiddo. I'll figure something out." The drive back to base was brutal without my jacket. The heater in my truck barely worked, and the cold seeped through my uniform like ice water. But every time I started to feel sorry for myself, I thought about Ben's blue lips and shivering body, and I knew I'd made the right choice. When I got back to the supply store, I finished my shift and locked up for the night. As I walked across the base to my barracks, the wind cut through my thin uniform shirt like a knife. Other sailors I passed gave me strange looks, probably wondering why I was walking around in a blizzard without a coat. I didn't care what they thought. That little boy was safe and warm, and that was all that mattered. I'd worry about getting a replacement jacket tomorrow. For tonight, I was just grateful that Ben had made it home to his grandmother. Little did I know that my simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. Sometimes the smallest gestures have the biggest consequences, and giving away my jacket that night was about to teach me that lesson in ways I never could have imagined. The next morning hit me like a freight train. I woke up in my bunk with a scratchy throat and stuffy nose, probably from walking around in that blizzard without my jacket, but I didn't regret it for a second. As I got dressed for my shift, I stared at the empty hook where my Navy jacket usually hung. The reality of what I'd done was starting to sink in. I threw on my uniform shirt and headed to the supply store, hoping nobody would notice right away. The base was buzzing with activity as sailors went about their morning routines. I kept my head down and walked quickly, trying to avoid any conversations that might draw attention to my missing jacket. Petty Officer Williams was already at the store when I arrived, checking inventory on his clipboard. He was a good supervisor, fair but strict, and he'd been in the Navy long enough to know every regulation by heart. I tried to slip past him to start my duties, but he looked up just as I was hanging my cap on the hook. "Carter," he said, his eyes scanning my uniform. "Where's your jacket?" My stomach dropped. I'd been hoping to make it through at least one day before anyone noticed. It's being cleaned, sir." I lied, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. He raised an eyebrow. "Cleaned? Since when do you get your uniforms professionally cleaned? And why didn't you have a backup?" I scrambled for another excuse. "It got really dirty yesterday, and I wanted to make sure it was properly taken care of. I should have my spare back from the laundry tomorrow." William studied my face for a long moment, and I could tell he didn't quite believe me. But he just shrugged and went back to his clipboard. "Make sure you do. You know how Admiral Blake feels about proper uniform standards." The mention of Admiral Blake sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Alaskan weather. Everyone on base knew about his legendary uniform inspections. He could spot a missing button from 50 yards away, and he had zero tolerance for sailors who didn't meet his standards. The man had been in the Navy for over 30 years, and his reputation for discipline was known throughout the entire fleet. I spent the morning trying to figure out how to get a replacement jacket. My first stop was the uniform supply office, but the clerk just laughed when I asked about getting a new one. "Are you kidding me, Carter? We've been waiting 3 weeks for our last shipment. The supply ship got delayed because of ice in the shipping lanes. We won't see new jackets for at least another 2 weeks, maybe 3. 2 weeks. My heart sank. There was no way I could go 2 weeks without someone noticing, especially if Admiral Blake decided to do one of his surprise inspections. I tried asking around to see if anyone had a spare jacket I could borrow, but everyone I talked to only had one. A few sailors offered to let me borrow theirs for special occasions, but I couldn't ask them to go without their jackets just to cover for me. By lunchtime, word was starting to spread that I was missing my jacket. Sailors loved to gossip, and a missing piece of uniform was prime material for speculation. I heard whispers in the mess hall as I picked at my food, trying to ignore the curious stares. "I heard Carter lost her jacket in a poker game," one sailor whispered to his friend. "No way. I heard she sold it to pay off some debt," another replied. "Maybe she just forgot to do laundry and it's sitting in a pile somewhere," suggested a third. None of them guessed the truth, which was probably for the best. If word got out that I'd given my jacket to a civilian child, it might cause even more problems. The Navy had strict rules about giving away government property, even for good reasons. That afternoon, Williams pulled me aside during a quiet moment in the store. "Carter, I'm going to give you some advice," he said, his voice serious. "Admiral Blake has been talking about doing a surprise inspection this week. You need to figure out your jacket situation, and fast." My blood turned to ice. "This week? Do you know when?" "If I knew when, it wouldn't be a surprise, would it?" he replied. "But I've seen the signs. He's been walking around the base more than usual, checking things out. When he starts doing that, an inspection usually follows within a few days." I thanked him for the warning and spent the rest of my shift in a panic. What was I going to do? I couldn't magically make a new jacket appear, and I couldn't take back what I'd done. Even if I could, I wouldn't. Ben needed that jacket more than I did. That evening, I decided to drive back to the village to check on Ben and his grandmother. Maybe seeing that the jacket was being put to good use would help me feel better about the mess I was in. When I knocked on the door of the little blue house, Agnes answered with a warm smile. "Alexis, how wonderful to see you again. Please, come in out of the cold." Ben was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, wearing my navy jacket over his regular clothes. It was still way too big for him, but he looked warm and comfortable. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Alexis, look, I'm still wearing your jacket. Grandma says I can keep it until spring comes." "That's right," I told him, ruffling his hair. "It looks good on you." Agnes made me a cup of hot chocolate, and we sat around the kitchen table talking. She told me more about their situation, how hard it had been since Ben's parents died, and how grateful she was for my kindness. Ben showed me his homework and told me about school. For a little while, I forgot about my problems back on base. But as I drove home that night, the reality came crashing back. Admiral Blake's inspection was coming, and I had no idea how I was going to explain my missing jacket. The morning of the inspection arrived like a death sentence. I'd barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as I imagined all the ways Admiral Blake might punish me for being out of uniform. Reduction in rank, extra duty, confinement to quarters, or worse, a formal reprimand that would follow me for the rest of my Navy career. I got dressed slowly, staring at my reflection in the small mirror above my sink. My uniform looked sharp except for the glaring absence of my jacket. I'd tried everything I could think of over the past few days. I'd even considered buying a civilian jacket and trying to pass it off as military issue, but that would have been an even worse violation. The announcement came over the base loudspeaker at exactly 0800 hours. "All personnel report to the main parade ground for uniform inspection. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel report to the main parade ground immediately." My hands were shaking as I walked across the base with hundreds of other sailors. Everyone was checking their uniforms one last time, straightening their caps, making sure their shoes were polished to perfection. I felt like I was walking to my own execution. The parade ground was a massive concrete area where we held ceremonies and formations. Admiral Blake stood at the front, his own uniform immaculate as always. Even from a distance, I could see the rows of ribbons on his chest, representing decades of distinguished service. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and his posture was ramrod straight despite his age. We formed up in neat rows, standing at attention while the Admiral began his inspection. He started at the far end of the formation, moving slowly down each line. I was positioned about halfway back, which gave me plenty of time to watch his technique and worry about what would happen when he reached me. Admiral Blake was thorough. He examined every sailor from head to toe, checking for loose threads, scuffed shoes, crooked name tags, and any other imperfection. When he found something wrong, he would stop and point it out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I watched him dress down a sailor for having a wrinkled shirt, another for shoes that weren't shiny enough. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the sailor next to me could hear it. Sweat was beading on my forehead despite the cold morning air. I tried to stand perfectly still and look as professional as possible, but I knew it wouldn't matter. There was no hiding a missing jacket. Row by row, the Admiral worked his way closer to me. I could hear his footsteps on the concrete, the jingle of his keys, the occasional sharp comment when he found a uniform violation. Some sailors were dismissed after passing inspection, but others were told to remain behind for further discussion. I already knew which group I'd be joining. Finally, Admiral Blake reached my row. He started at the far end, working his way toward me one sailor at a time. I watched him examine the woman to my left, checking her uniform with the same meticulous attention he'd given everyone else. She passed inspection and was dismissed. Then he was standing in front of me. Admiral Blake was taller than I'd expected, probably 6 feet 2 inches, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. His face was weathered from years of sea duty, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. When he looked at me, I felt like he could read every thought in my head. He started at the top, examining my cap, my hair, my collar. His eyes moved down to my shirt, checking the alignment of my ribbons and name tag. Everything was perfect so far. Then his gaze moved to where my jacket should have been. The silence stretched on forever. Admiral Blake stared at the empty space where my jacket should have been, then looked back up at my face. His expression was unreadable, but I could feel the weight of his disappointment. Other sailors in the formation were starting to notice what was happening, and I could sense their curiosity. "Seaman Carter," Admiral Blake said finally, his voice carrying across the parade ground. "Where is your jacket?" My mouth felt like sandpaper. "Sir, I don't have it with me, sir." "I can see that," he replied, his tone icy. The question is why. I wanted to tell him the truth, to explain about Ben and the blizzard and how I couldn't let a child freeze to death. But standing there in front of hundreds of my fellow sailors, with the Admiral's stern gaze boring into me, the words wouldn't come. "No excuse, sir," I managed to say. Admiral Blake continued his inspection of the rest of my uniform, but I could tell his mind was focused on the missing jacket. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at me for a long moment. "The rest of your uniform is satisfactory," he said. "However, the absence of your jacket is a serious violation of Navy regulations." He moved on to inspect the next sailor, but before he did, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Seaman Carter, you will remain after the inspection is complete. We need to discuss your jacket." The rest of the inspection passed in a blur. I stood at attention while Admiral Blake finished examining the remaining sailors, but I wasn't really paying attention. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I was going to say when he questioned me privately. When the last sailor had been inspected, Admiral Blake dismissed the formation. Everyone else headed back to their duties, but I remained standing alone on the parade ground. The Admiral walked over to me, his expression serious. "Follow me to my office, Seaman Carter," he said. "We need to have a conversation about your jacket." As we walked across the base toward the Admiral's office, he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "Your jacket, Carter. It's in my house." I followed Admiral Blake across the base in complete silence, my mind spinning like a tornado. What did he mean my jacket was in his house? How could that be possible? I'd given it to Ben, and Ben lived with his grandmother Agnes in that little blue house near the church, unless... The Admiral's office was in the main administrative building, an imposing structure that housed the base's command center. I'd never been inside before, and under different circumstances, I might have been impressed by the polished floors and official portraits lining the hallways. But right now, all I could think about was those 5 words, "Your jacket is in my house." Admiral Blake's office was exactly what I'd expected. The walls were covered with commendations, photographs from his various assignments, and a large American flag stood in the corner. His desk was perfectly organized, with neat stacks of papers and a single pen placed precisely in the center. He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. "Close the door, Carter," he said quietly. I did as he asked, then returned to my seat. My hands were trembling slightly, and I clasped them together in my lap to keep them still. Admiral Blake sat down behind his desk and studied me for what felt like an eternity. "Do you know why your jacket is in my house?" he asked finally. I shook my head, not trusting my voice to work properly. Admiral Blake leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. For the first time since I'd known of him, he looked tired. The stern mask he always wore seemed to slip, revealing something more human underneath. 8 years ago, he began, my daughter married a fisherman from the village. A good man, but I didn't approve of the match. I thought she was throwing her life away, leaving behind all the opportunities her education had given her. We had a terrible fight about it, and I said things I shouldn't have said. He paused, staring out the window at the snow-covered base. "Pride is a dangerous thing, Carter. It can make you do stupid things, say words you can never take back. My daughter left that day, and we never spoke again." My heart was starting to race as I began to understand where this story was going. 2 years ago, my daughter and her husband were killed in a fishing accident. They left behind a son, an 8-year-old boy named Ben. The room felt like it was spinning. Ben was Admiral Blake's grandson. The little boy I'd given my jacket to was the commanding officer's own family. "I wanted to help," Admiral Blake continued, his voice growing quieter. "I wanted to take Ben in, to give him everything he needed, but my pride got in the way again. I told myself that his grandmother could take care of him, that he didn't need me. I convinced myself that it was better this way." He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a folder. "But I couldn't just ignore him completely. I've been sending anonymous money to his grandmother every month. I made sure the school had everything Ben needed. I even had someone keeping an eye on him, making sure he was safe." Admiral Blake looked directly at me. "Last week during that blizzard, I was driving home late from a meeting in town. I saw you put that little boy in your truck. I followed you to make sure he got home safely." My mouth fell open. "You saw me give him my jacket?" "I saw everything," he said. "I watched you take off your own jacket and wrap it around my grandson. I saw you drive him home through that storm, making sure he was safe. And I watched you leave without asking for anything in return. Tears were starting to form in my eyes. I'd been so worried about getting in trouble, but Admiral Blake had known the truth all along. "Do you know what that meant to me?" he asked. "To see a stranger show more kindness to my grandson than I'd shown him in 2 years? To watch someone risk their own career to keep a child warm?" He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. I went to see Ben the next day. I told Agnes who I was, and we had a long conversation about everything that had happened. She's a remarkable woman, and she's done an incredible job raising Ben despite having very little. Admiral Blake turned back to face me. "Ben was wearing your jacket when I met him. He told me all about the nice Navy lady who saved him from the snow. He said you were the kindest person he'd ever met." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. "Sir, I just couldn't let him freeze. I know I violated regulations by giving away government property, but—" "Carter," Admiral Blake interrupted, holding up his hand. "You did exactly what any decent human being should do. You put a child's safety above your own concerns. That's not a violation of regulations. That's the highest form of service." He sat back down at his desk and pulled out another folder. "I've been thinking about this situation all week, about Ben, about you, about the mistakes I've made as a grandfather, and I've come to a decision." Admiral Blake opened the folder and began writing something on an official-looking form. "I'm not going to punish you for missing your jacket, Carter. In fact, I'm going to do something that might surprise you." He looked up at me with something that might have been a smile. "How would you feel about a promotion?" I stared at Admiral Blake in complete shock. "A promotion, sir? I don't understand." He finished writing on the form and set his pen down carefully. "Carter, what you did for Ben showed me something I'd forgotten after all these years in the military. Sometimes the most important missions aren't the ones that come with official orders. Sometimes they're the ones that come from the heart." Admiral Blake stood up and walked around his desk to sit in the chair next to mine. It was strange seeing him outside his usual position of authority, almost like he was just a regular person instead of the commanding officer of the entire base. "I've been thinking about creating a new position," he said. "A community liaison officer who works with local families in need. Someone who can bridge the gap between the base and the village, help coordinate support for people who are struggling. After what I witnessed last week, I can't think of anyone better suited for that job than you." My head was spinning. "Sir, I'm just a seaman. I work in the supply store. I don't have any special training for something like that." "You have something more valuable than training," Admiral Blake replied. "You have compassion. You have the ability to see someone in need and act without thinking about the consequences to yourself. That's exactly what this job requires." He handed me the form he'd been writing on. It was a promotion recommendation, advancing me from seaman to petty officer 3rd class. But more than that, it was a complete change in my duties and responsibilities. "The position comes with a pay increase," Admiral Blake continued. "Enough that you'll be able to send more money home to your mother and still live comfortably. You'll also have access to base resources to help families in the community: food, clothing, medical supplies, whatever they need." I looked down at the form, hardly believing what I was reading. "Sir, why are you doing this for me?" Admiral Blake was quiet for a long moment. "Because you gave me the courage to do something I should have done 2 years ago. Yesterday, I went to see Ben and Agnes. I told them who I was, and I asked if I could be part of their lives." His voice grew softer. "Ben was wearing your jacket when I knocked on their door. When Agnes introduced me as his grandfather, the first thing he said was that he wanted me to meet the Navy lady who saved him. He talked about you for an hour, about how kind you were, how you made sure he got home safely." Admiral Blake smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely happy. "Agnes and I talked for hours. She told me about all the struggles they faced, all the time she worried about making ends meet. She never asked me for help because she didn't know who I was, but she never complained either. She just did whatever she had to do to take care of Ben." He pulled out his phone and showed me a picture. It was Ben, grinning widely while wearing my Navy jacket, standing next to Admiral Blake in what looked like Agnes's kitchen. This was taken yesterday. "Ben insisted I take a picture with him wearing your jacket so he could show you the next time he saw you." Tears were flowing freely down my cheeks now. He looked so happy. "He is happy," Admiral Blake said, "and so am I. For the first time in years, Agnes has agreed to let me help them. Ben and she are going to move into one of the family housing units on base. Ben will go to the base school, And Agnes is going to work as a teacher there. We're going to be a real family." He stood up and walked back to his desk. "But none of this would have happened without you, Carter. Your simple act of kindness set everything in motion. You didn't just save Ben from freezing that night. You saved our entire family." Admiral Blake picked up another folder from his desk. "Your new position starts Monday. You'll work with the base chaplain and the Family Services Office to identify families in need, both on base and in the community. You'll coordinate relief efforts, organize volunteer programs, and make sure no child in this area ever has to face what Ben faced that night." I wiped my eyes and tried to compose myself. "Sir, I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough." "Don't thank me," he replied. "Thank yourself for having the courage to do the right thing when it mattered most, and thank Ben for reminding an old sailor what really matters in life." There was a knock on the office door, and Admiral Blake called for whoever it was to come in. The door opened, and Ben came running in, still wearing my navy jacket. Agnes followed behind him, smiling warmly. "Alexis!" Ben shouted, running over to give me a hug. "Grandpa told me you were here. Look, I'm still wearing your jacket." I hugged him tightly, feeling like my heart might burst with happiness. "It looks perfect on you, buddy." Agnes came over and shook my hand. "I can never thank you enough for what you did for Ben, and now, thanks to you, we're all going to be together as a family." Admiral Blake put his arm around Ben's shoulders. "Carter, I'd like you to meet my grandson officially. Ben, this is Petty Officer Carter. She's going to be working on some very special projects to help other families, just like she helped us." Ben looked up at me with those same big brown eyes I remembered from that snowy night. "Does this mean we'll get to see you all the time now?" I looked around the room at this unlikely family that had been brought together by a simple act of kindness on a freezing night. "Yes, Ben, you're going to see me all the time." And as I watched Admiral Blake ruffle his grandson's hair while Agnes beamed with joy, I realized that sometimes the smallest gestures really do have the biggest consequences. My navy jacket had found its way home after all,